read Pope Benedict's new encyclical just a couple of nights ago, and I was very impressed by it. It's a very dense, complex text, but it's just chock full of ideas. It's very deeply in continuity with the great Catholic social teaching tradition, but also contains a number of novelties, of real new ideas. One thing I'd mention first, the title, Caritas and Veritate, Love in Truth. That's a classic Joseph Ratzinger, Pope Benedict theme, that love and truth belong together. He has a neat formula. He says, love without truth devolves into sentimentality, something very superficial. Truth without love becomes cold and calculating. The Church stands for the coming together of love in truth. He also says they're both grounded in God. God's described in the New Testament as agape, love, but also as logos, truth. So when truth and love come together, we have the ground for a social teaching. Yeah, I'll give you a good example of that. Let's say someone is a person of love. I want to love, but have no idea how to focus that love. Have no sense of human nature, of the objective good, of the way things really work. Well, then your love is fine in itself, but it won't express itself well. It'll devolve into that superficial sentimentality. But if you love and you know what's really good, you want the good for the other and you know what it is, then your love will become very powerful and very effective. That's what he's driving at. You know, a second theme I'd emphasize is this. Pope Benedict wrote this for the 40th anniversary of Populorum Progressio. That means the progress of peoples. It was a letter written by Pope Paul VI back in the late 60s. And Pope Benedict says you have to read that letter in connection with Humanae Vitae, the controversial letter of Paul VI about artificial contraception. And here's the insight, which I think is a very good one. He said issues of life ethics, like Humanae Vitae, are deeply connected to questions of social ethics, of the economy and the political life. Now, why? Because both have to be predicated upon a very deep openness to life, an affirmation of life at all levels. If in my personal life I've kind of closed down that option, well, that will have ramifications in the public realm. One thing he mentions, too, very pragmatically, look at a lot of Western societies, especially in Europe, and he's very attuned to the situation in Europe, where there has been this closing down of the option for life. Let's say contraception is widely practiced, euthanasia in some cases is legally protected, when abortion is widely available. What's happened pragmatically is you now have societies that are very top-heavy. You have an awful lot of older people, but there's not a replacement generation coming along. And that has led to these very deep imbalances and inequities in the social system. So it's both a theoretical problem and a very practical problem, he points out. You know, a third thing that I think is very new in Pope Benedict's letter is it's a very interesting addition. He says, alongside of the contractual logic of the marketplace, that means I give in order to get something from you. So it's a agreement sort of logic, contract logic. Alongside of that, you have the political logic, which is a logic of obligation. So you are obliged to give, let's say through taxation and social programs and so on. You're obliged to give in order to foster justice in the society. Both those are good, both those are fine, and they're in a certain balance with each other. But the Pope says, alongside those two, there's got to be a third, which is the logic of sheer gratuity. That means I give, not because I'm contractually obliged or legally obliged, but I give simply because it's good to give. It's the logic of sheer generosity. And without that, he says, both the economic and the legal devolve into something less than fully human. And I think that's really fascinating. It's a sort of leaven that must exist in any society. We have to go beyond the language of mere justice and find the language of real love. Otherwise, the economies will become less than human. Something else which I think is very new in this letter, and I've read and taught the social teaching tradition now for many years at the seminary, so I know this trajectory of text pretty well. This is the most thoroughgoing discussion of the environment and of our obligation to care for the environment. A very strong language, and it's an extended discussion of it. And here's what I find really fascinating. Benedict makes a very helpful distinction. He says, in regard to nature, we neither idolize it nor exploit it, precisely because we believe in a creator God. Nature is a creature of God. Therefore, what? It's marked by God. It's part of God's plan. It's good and beautiful and should be respected. Absolutely. But precisely because it's created, it's not God. Therefore, nature is not the final horizon of my life, not the final context. He sees the danger of a kind of neo-paganism in certain forms of the ecological or environmental movement, as though nature is the absolute good. No, it's a creature. But he says very strong things, therefore, about how it should be respected and how that should be integral in our understanding of economics. If we have adopted an economic perspective that simply allows for the exploitation of the earth, we have a serious moral problem. And that's unique. That's a very strong novelty, I think, in this letter. I like this letter very much, but there are a couple moments I would probably pull back a bit and be critical. One is the Pope, toward the end of the letter, calls very strongly for a kind of world government or an international political entity that would be able to have some control over the political and economic realities of the world. And there he's echoing a view of Pope John the 23rd. Way back in the early 1960s, John the 23rd called for a very strong United Nations that would have this role. And Pope Benedict, too, echoes that. Well, I think ideally there's something to it. Something tells me, given the realities on the ground, there's something rather utopian about that dream, that there might be a supranational political force. I just don't think it's a realistic proposal, especially in regard to the United Nations, which I think has a role to play, but I just wouldn't put that much weight on the United Nations, given its own rather fractious history. There's something else I'd say, maybe on the negative ledger. Much of the letter, to me, doesn't sound like Pope Benedict. Now, I've been reading Joseph Ratzinger for many years, and he's a very gracious writer and a very strong synthesizing mind. The beginning of the letter sounds like him, all this discussion of truth and love and their relationship. But one of the marks of Joseph Ratzinger's style is a very strong biblical and patristic sensibility. Frankly, for a lot of the letter, I find that missing. And it reads to me a bit like the work of a committee, that a lot of different hands were involved. Now, that's par for the course. I mean, many papal encyclicals are written by different people, and they've made drafts and so on. But with this Pope, who's such a great theologian and such a great writer in his own right, I regretted that a bit. To me, it seemed to miss some of his stylistic elan. That said, I think it remains a very powerful letter, an important one. And it's a very good addition to this strong tradition of the Church's social teaching.